Imagine waking up one morning and discovering every peso you've ever saved is locked inside a bank you cannot touch. That is exactly what happened to millions of Argentines in December 2001. This is the story of Maria and Diego, two ordinary people swallowed by an extraordinary financial catastrophe. If you want more powerful finance stories like this one, subscribe to our channel right now. Maria was a 34-year-old schoolteacher in Buenos Aires. She had spent 12 years carefully saving every spare peso she earned. Diego was her 38-year-old husband, factory supervisor, who had worked double shifts for a decade to build their family's future. Together, they had accumulated $77,000 in their bank account, a fortune by Argentine standards. They trusted this system completely. The government had promised the peso was as safe as the dollar. Since 1991, Argentina had maintained a policy called currency convertibility, which kept one Argentine peso equal to $1 at all times. For ordinary families like Maria and Diego, this felt like ironclad security. Their savings would never lose value. When the peso was first linked to the US dollar in February 1991, initial economic effects were quite positive. Inflation was dramatically curtailed and foreign investment poured in. Argentina felt modern, prosperous, and stable. The 1990s brought shopping malls, imported goods, and middle-class dreams. Diego bought a second-hand car. Maria remodeled their small apartment. They were planning a mortgage. Life felt genuinely good. But behind the shining facade, the government was doing something terrifying. It was borrowing money it could never repay. By the end of the military government in 1983, Argentina's foreign debt had ballooned from $8 billion to $45 billion, and industrial production had already fallen by 20%. That debt never truly disappeared. It was simply restructured, repackaged, and handed to new governments like a financial time bomb. Argentina's 2001 collapse resulted from a complex mix of fiscal weakness, a rigid currency peg, large external debt, and abrupt stops in foreign financing. By the late 1990s, the US dollar was strengthening dramatically against currencies worldwide. Argentina's peso strengthened with it. A strong peso hurt Argentine exports and caused a protracted economic downturn that eventually led to the abandonment of the peso-dollar parity in 2002. Diego's factory began cutting orders. Fewer exports meant less production. Managers warned workers that layoffs were coming. Maria noticed her school was not receiving government funding on time. Teachers were being paid in government-issued IOUs instead of real money. By December 6, 2001, the government was issuing quasi-currencies to pay salaries, as it had completely run out of real money to function. Argentina was essentially becoming a country that printed fake money to pretend it could pay its bills. The lies were piling up fast. The poverty rate had already risen from 25.9% in 1998 to 38.3% by 2001, would explode to 57.5% in 2002. In the streets of Buenos Aires, something was visibly shifting. Unemployment lines stretched around entire city blocks. By the end of 2001, the unemployment rate was around 23%, and 40,000 companies had shut their doors since the crisis deepened in 1998. Diego watched 3 colleagues get fired in 1 week. He kept his job, but his salary was reduced by 30% without warning. Maria started buying less food. She canceled the family vacation. She told her daughter they were being responsible, but the truth was fear. Then came the moment that changed everything. November 29, 2001. Maria turned on the television and saw something that stopped her breathing. The crisis reached a breaking point on November 29, 2001. Major investors began withdrawing their deposits from banks, causing the collapse of Argentina's banking system due to massive capital flight. Wealthy companies and foreign investors had been secretly moving their money out of Argentina for months. They had been warned quietly by bank insiders. In mid-2001, It was probably clear to bank owners and high-ranking officials that Argentina's banking system was going to crash, and some may have let their highest deposit holders know this news. While rich insiders escaped with their fortunes intact, ordinary families like Maria and Diego were kept completely in the dark. Diego called his bank immediately. The lines were jammed. He drove there. Long, anxious crowd had already formed outside the doors. Then came December 1st, 2001. Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo announced the measure that would destroy millions of lives overnight. On December 2nd, Finance Minister Cavallo announced a national cash withdrawal limit of $250 per week, known informally as El Corralito. The Spanish word corralito is the diminutive of corral, meaning animal pen or enclosure, a word that perfectly captured how Argentines suddenly felt like trapped animals. Maria and Diego's $77,000 was now untouchable. They could withdraw only $250 per week. Every single peso was effectively frozen. One Argentine described the moment. Of the $77,000 I had in the bank, I lost $40,000 in the corralito. That December was terrible. There were riots everywhere. Diego stood at the ATM machine staring at the screen. His entire life savings shone on that screen, and he could not access a single cent beyond the weekly limit. The economy turned from recession to depression as people and businesses could not make payments. Credit evaporated entirely overnight. Maria went to the supermarket with their last $250 cash. The shelves were already half empty. Panic buyers had stripped the stores clean. By December 5th, sales in shops had collapsed by 50 to 70%. Formal barter clubs formed nationwide, eventually reaching more than 1.5 million people. Maria joined one of those barter clubs in her neighborhood. She traded her extra cooking pots for bags of rice and flour. Money had become meaningless. Workers banded together, broke into and occupied their former closed workplaces, and restarted silent, rusting machines, successfully reorganizing factories as worker cooperatives. Diego's factory eventually shut down completely. He was handed a piece of paper telling him his job was gone. No severance, no explanation. The streets of Buenos Aires erupted. Thousands of furious citizens poured out of their homes, banging pots and pans in a protest called the Catrolazo. People chanted loudly outside banks, "Coros, coros, devuelvan los ojoros," meaning thieves, thieves, give back our savings, as they hammered on the locked metal shutters. Maria joined the protests with their neighbors. She carried a pot in one hand and her daughter's hand in the other. The noise was deafening. Across Argentina, a chant rang out through the streets. "Cuse vian todos, que no quid ni no solo," meaning they all must leave. Let not a single one remain. The bank withdrawal freeze led to widespread protests across Buenos Aires, initially peaceful, but later involving damage to property, including attacks on banks and foreign-owned companies. Fires burned on Buenos Aires avenues, shop windows were shattered. Diego watched the bank branch near their home get set ablaze by a mob of desperate people. President Fernando de la Rúa declared a state of emergency. But that decision only threw fuel onto an already raging inferno. Rioting and protests became widespread on December 19th, 2001, immediately following the president's declaration of a state of emergency. Over the course of the protests, 39 people were killed by police and security forces, most of them during violent clashes in provinces governed by Peronists. Maria heard gunshots from their apartment window on the night of December 19th. She pulled her daughter under the kitchen table and did not move for hours. President Fernando de la Rúa resigned on December 20th, 2001, after violent riots made governing the country impossible. A sitting president had just fled his own country's capital in a helicopter. Argentina had no leader. It had no money. It had no plan. The 10 days that followed, Argentina witnessed the succession of 5 different presidents, each unable to control the catastrophe unfolding around them. 5 presidents in 10 days. Diego watched each one take office on television and collapse within days. It was beyond surreal. Adolfo Rodriguez Sá was eventually appointed interim president during the last week of 2001. His administration defaulted on $132 billion in public debt, a seventh of all money owed by the entire Third World. That default was the largest sovereign debt default in recorded history at that point. Argentina had simply stopped paying the world back. By the end of the year, Argentina's sovereign debt reached $93 billion. Unemployment hit 22.5%, and the poverty line rose to 57.5%, forcing the president and most of his cabinet to resign. Then came the second crushing blow. The government announced pesofication, a forced conversion of all dollar savings into pesos. All bank accounts denominated in dollars would be converted to pesos at an official rate, with deposits converted at 1.40 pesos per dollar, while debt was converted on a 1-to-1 basis. This was a deliberate theft disguised as policy. Savers got 1.40 pesos for every dollar. But the real exchange rate quickly fell to nearly 4 pesos per dollar. By October 2002, depositors who withdrew their savings had lost 50% of their value in dollars, half their lifetime savings, simply erased by government decree. Maria and Diego's $77,000 was now worth less than $20,000 in real purchasing power. Years of sacrifice evaporated in months. Historian Philippe Pigna described the lasting damage. There was a strong sense of orphanhood and deep distrust of institutions, the state, and the banks. That distrust ran so deep that Argentines began hiding cash inside mattresses, behind walls, and under floorboards, rather than trusting banks ever again. The unemployment rate rose above 20%, and inflation reached a monthly rate of about 20% in April 2002, meaning prices were doubling every few months. Maria returned to teaching, but her salary was now worth a fraction of what it once was. She carried lunch in a bag because she could no longer afford restaurants. Diego found informal work fixing machinery for a local cooperative. He earned barely enough to buy groceries. Pride had been replaced by survival instinct. In Buenos Aires, a McDonald's began throwing unsold food into the street, and desperate people would gather outside to eat whatever was discarded there. That image, educated, working-class people gathering at a fast food restaurant's garbage, became the defining symbol of Argentina's humiliation. The economic collapse had turned what was once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations into a country where the middle class was begging on streets they once owned. And yet, remarkably, the Argentine people did not simply collapse. Communities created something extraordinary from the wreckage. Barter networks spread throughout Greater Buenos Aires and neighboring provinces, and they also began issuing their own local currencies. With several dozen trooped currencies in circulation by early 2002, Maria became one of the most active barter network organizers in her district. She helped neighbors trade skills, food, and goods without a single peso changing hands. Diego retrained as an electrician within the worker cooperative movement. Within a year, he was earning a modest but stable income. Slowly, agonizingly, Argentina began to breathe again. By 2003, the worst of the economic collapse had passed. Thanks to changes in domestic bank business models from 2003 to 2008, Argentina's economy actually performed well, recovering strongly from the disaster of 2001, but the scars never fully healed. Maria and Diego never fully trusted a bank again. They kept cash hidden at home for years afterward. Even decades later, fake news of a new corralito was enough to provoke a fresh wave of bank withdrawals, showing how deeply the trauma was embedded in the national psyche. The story of Argentina 2001 is not just a story about bad economics. It is a story about how governments can betray their own people. It is a story about how the peso dollar peg sold to Argentines as protection became the very chain that strangled them. It is a story about how the IMF walked away when it was most needed, abandoning a nation on its knees. The financial catastrophe of 2001 was not only the result of Argentina's own economic mismanagement, it was also the combined impact of neoliberal policies imposed from outside and the IMF's decision to abandon Argentina at its lowest point. It is a story that still echoes today, as Argentina continues to wrestle with debt, inflation, and an IMF it cannot seem to escape. Today, despite decades of recovery efforts, poverty levels in Argentina remain around 40%, in a country that was once among the world's wealthiest in the early 20th century. Maria and Diego are older now. Their daughter has grown up. She keeps her money in 3 different places, trusting none of them completely. That is the real legacy of 2001. Not the statistics, not the defaulted bonds, but a generation of people who learned that the system can be weaponized against the very people it claims to protect. What do you think about Argentina's 2001 collapse? Was it purely the government's fault? Was the IMF also responsible? Or was this an inevitable outcome of flawed global financial policies? Drop your opinion in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And if this story made you think, made you angry, or made you more financially aware, then please subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss another story like this one. Your support keeps these stories alive.